Welcome back to the Bridgehead Briefing. Today we're going to be covering the acrimonious divorce that Mark Zuckerberg is currently undergoing with the transgender movement and how that's going to affect our entire culture and the transgender debate. Second of all, we're going to be covering Pierre Poilievre's ongoing war with trans activists, especially some comments he made over the holiday season that indicate a big change from the woke policies of the Trudeau years. Finally, we're going to ask the question, should influencers who call themselves Christian and conservative associate with or platform Andrew Tate? Is he or is he not one of the good guys? That's all coming up. Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook and Meta, has decided to divorce the transgender movement, and it's extremely acrimonious. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this story. Mark Zuckerberg now is restructuring the way Meta is set up. So Meta includes both Facebook and Instagram, and he's changing all kinds of things. He's essentially divested himself from all of the fact checkers who essentially enforced a progressive consensus. But most specifically, he is removing the transgender gatekeepers from these platforms. Now, this may seem like kind of a small story because there's some really humorous things that happened over the weekend. The New York Times reported that Meta removed the tampon dispensers from the male bathrooms at their headquarters. So for those of you who didn't know they had tampon dispensers in the male bathrooms at Meta, they did and now they don't. And then Mark Zuckerberg also removed the transgender and non-binary themes from Meta's messengers. Some of you may remember like the little pregnant man emojis and stuff like that. Apparently, Zuckerberg is done with all of that. And what's really interesting about that to me is so many major influencers, major corporate figures, major politicians over the last 5 to 10 years have claimed to believe all kinds of crazy stuff. And now, as it turns out, as we see the kind of tide of transgender activism slowly starting to recede, it turns out most of them didn't actually believe any of this at all. And they were just being forced by the transgender movement to abide by the new reigning ideology. And the transgender movement captured the institutions of big tech in particular almost overnight, and the cultural power this gave them was extraordinary. And now that they're losing this power, they're fighting back desperately. So just to give you a bit of context for Mark Zuckerberg's move at Meta, let me give an example of what took place when Elon Musk bought Twitter, renamed it X, and then removed a lot of the major content restrictions. Because basically Meta and Twitter were setting the terms for the debate. They were enforcing transgender ideology, and that meant that the way we could discuss the issue, it was incredibly narrow, and it was essentially limited to terminology pre-approved by the transgender movement. So on Twitter, pre-Elon Musk, for example, referring to a trans-identifying male as a male, so that would mean like referring to Bruce Jenner as a he, that could get you permanently banned from the platform. And lots of major accounts were banned from Twitter, essentially evicted from the digital public square, simply for telling the truth about a trans-identifying person like Bruce Jenner. Same thing for so-called dead naming. And just to kind of give you an easy example for what dead naming is, it means referring to a trans-identifying person by their original name. So calling Bruce Jenner Bruce rather than Caitlyn, which is his transgender alter ego name. That would also get you evicted and permanently banned from this platform. Now, the terms set by social media basically ensured that those of us who disagree fundamentally with the premises of gender ideology could not tell the truth without being removed from the debate. And it's clear that the cultural impact that this had was huge. And let me give you one particularly potent example. So when Elon Musk purchased Twitter, he eliminated many of the free speech rules, or I should say the restrictive speech rules, and restored the accounts of many influencers who had been banned for misgendering or dead naming. And the ripple effect was almost immediate. So J.K. Rowling, the famous Harry Potter author, who's now most well known for fighting transgender ideology, using her X account as the primary platform to do so, she has been using her platform to launch a pretty much incessant rhetorical war against transgender ideology. And this has had a devastating effect because suddenly previously silenced voices could get their message out to millions. And this even had political effects. So let me cite one example that I wrote about at the time. When transgender activists claimed last year that Scotland's new Hate Crime Act also applied to misgendering, J.K. Rowling promptly broke the law on X by citing a whole bunch of trans-identifying males and referring to them as males. And then she challenged the authorities to arrest her for doing so under Scotland's new hate crime laws. And she basically said, anybody who does this, who is in Scotland, I will retweet them. And if the police arrest them, they have to retweet me as well. And this was retweeted millions of times, or had millions of impressions, and Arrest Me started trending across Twitter. And shortly thereafter, the police sheepishly affirmed that she had not actually broken the law. But there's no doubt that if she hadn't had this platform, the police would have continued to silently suppress dissenting voices, which was very much happening in Scotland. And so J.K. Rowling used X to essentially defang the hate crime law in Scotland. This would have been impossible on pre-Musk Twitter, and it means that having the ability to speak to a large audience and to speak the truth to a large audience allows us to actually change the culture and allows us actually to defend dissenters who may not have a large voice. Now, Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, is doing the same thing. Besides, as I mentioned, eliminating their relationship with fact checkers, he says they want to return to their free speech roots. And most importantly, this means ending their censorship around gender ideology. And unsurprisingly, trans activists and their media allies are responding with panic because, again, the gates set up on social media is one of the ways they've policed the debate and ensured the truth about transgender ideology couldn't be told. So the headline at The Independent is a good example of the way the press is covering this. Their headline reads, quote, Facebook lifts its restrictions on calling women property and transgender people freaks. In other words, that's what they want you to take away from the loosening of free speech restrictions on Facebook and Instagram. And they noted that the new policy includes, quote, new clauses apparently designed to explicitly allow common anti-trans arguments, such as advocating for trans people to be banned from public bathrooms, school sports, or certain jobs. In other words, we can now actually debate legislation that is already on the books in 50 American states. We're now allowed to actually debate the Cass Review, which was brought about by the National Health Service of the UK. We're actually now allowed to discuss the political debate going on right across the Western world because Meta has loosened the free speech censorship that it had previously imposed on all of its users. Now, it's certainly true that allowing a genuine debate on gender ideology was part of the motivation behind the changes in the policy, which is encouraging. So let me look at just a couple of the new rules on Meta's website here. New rules include, quote, people sometimes use sex or gender exclusive language when discussing access to spaces often limited by sex or gender, such as bathrooms, specific schools, specific military, law enforcement, or teaching roles, and health or support groups. Other times they call for exclusion or use insulting language in the context of discussing political or religious topics, such as when discussing transgender rights, immigration, or homosexuality. Finally, sometimes people curse at gender in the context of a romantic breakup. Our policies are designed to allow room for these types of speech. So interestingly, Zuckerberg is actually positively explaining the kinds of offensive speech or perceived offensive speech is now permitted on Meta, although I really thought the cursing a gender in the context of a romantic breakup was an oddly specific thing to include in the new rules. He goes on, we do allow content arguing for gender-based limitations of military, law enforcement, and teaching jobs. We also allow the same content based on sexual orientation when the content is based on religious beliefs. That one in particular is revealing because the fact that they're proactively permitting it now indicates that this is the kind of speech that was previously limited across Facebook and Instagram. It means that those who were arguing against LGBT ideology from the perspective of religion were previously being restricted, which those of us who have been writing about issues like this on those platforms for years noticed a very long time ago. Now those censorships have been removed, and we'll start to see if there's still shadow banning or if a bigger reach will now be possible. Finally, they note, we do allow allegations of mental illness or abnormality when based on gender or sexual orientation, given political and religious discourse about transgenderism and homosexuality and common non-serious usage of words like weird. So again, some of the specificities going through this very, very formal list of changes to the policy, when basically Zuckerberg's like, no, you're allowed to call trans activists weird now. I've seen enough. This is going to be permitted on our platforms for sure. Again, he's the one who made that very specific inclusion and not me. Now, LGBT groups have already condemned these changes, as I noted with GLAAD, claiming that the platforms are now unsafe for users. Unsafe, their term, not mine. The reality, however, is that they're furious that they have lost control of yet another major social institution. And the evidence, once again, is that the Overton window is shifting away from gender ideology rather than towards it. And that Musk's free speech regime on X already illustrated that allowing an open debate on transgenderism puts trans activists at a major disadvantage. And the only way that they could keep a lid on the debate and enforce their premises was by ensuring that people were literally not allowed to tell the truth. They were not allowed to call trans-identifying males he. They were not allowed to use people's dead names. People were getting permanently banned from these platforms simply for noticing what was going on. They were getting banned simply for believing their own lying eyes. First, X removed those rules. Now it looks like Meta is as well. And maybe he won't. Zuckerberg, it looks like, has read the writing on the wall and acted accordingly. If he actually sticks to this, other companies will likely follow suit. If you want to know why I think he's probably going to allow for more speech, he's been going on an apology tour recently. He went on to Joe Rogan's, mainstream confessional to discuss all of the ways that he restricted free speech during COVID. But I think if you want to really see how nature is healing, removing the tampon dispensers at Meta's headquarters is probably a pretty good indication. Federal conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is taking on trans activists again. Many of you might have seen a previous episode where we broke down how Pierre Poilievre is rejecting gender ideology and what this might mean going forward, especially as we're set to have a major election in Canada this year. But in late December, Pierre Poilievre gave us a few more examples of what his position on gender ideology actually is. So on December 22, he tweeted out this: "Surreal, a man who killed his wife and 2 kids now claims he is a woman to go to a female prison. I can't believe I have to say this, but when I'm PM, there will be no male prisoners in female jails, period." And then again the next day, on December 23, he tweeted, "For nearly a year and a half as Trudeau's public safety minister, Dominic LeBlanc supported this weirdo policy allowing violent male criminals to move to female prisons where they can prey on women again. No wonder crime has spiraled out of control under LeBlanc." Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. First, he's drawing attention to a policy of the Trudeau governments that came in under Trudeau, and now it looks like will end under the Conservative Party when they form government, likely later this year. But it's worth taking a look at what's happened as a result of that policy here in Canada, because this policy has gotten almost no traction in the mainstream media, aside from a couple of really great reports in the National Post after the last couple of years. Now, Pierre was responding to a recent horror story out of Quebec. Let me quote that story from the Post, which came out a couple of weeks ago. "Mohamed Al-Balouz brutally killed his wife and 2 sons in 2022, and last week was sentenced to life in prison with no shot at parole for 25 years. Because he now identifies as Lavana, Al-Balouz has asked to serve that sentence in a woman's prison, the Juliet Institution for Women. If this wish is granted, female inmates there will have to share space with a male counterpart who stabbed his wife 23 times. It would be an absurd and inhumane scenario, and it's only possible because of a 2017 policy change championed by Trudeau that requires prisoners to be sorted according to gender identity and not genitalia." Now, that's not quite right. The reason that male criminals were being put into female prisons is because the law of the land under the Trudeau regime was that a man who identified as a woman was legally considered to be a woman, regardless of whether they'd made any attempt to go through a sex change and regardless of whether or not they were actually a woman. So the acceptance of gender ideology by the government resulted in women being assaulted in Canadian prisons by male prisoners. But the reason for that is because those male prisoners were considered to be female. Justin Trudeau thinks Lavana Mohammed Al-Balouz, what's-his-face, is actually a woman. Why? Because what's-his-face said that he is a woman. And that's enough under current Canadian law to get sent to a female prison. Now, interestingly, it's really interesting to see how the Canadian media frames these debates, because the newspapers want to recognize the sheer insanity of this policy, but they don't want to get into a brawl with Canada's very powerful LGBT activists. And so they try to sort of thread the needle by using language that the transgender activists accept while rejecting the agenda that the transgender activists advocate for. And so the Post says this: "Today, a fully intact criminal, rapists included, can be housed in the same facility as vulnerable women, balls and all. The first transfer, gang-related killer Fulton Albee, formerly Jean-Paul, was moved into a women's facility in 2017 in a move that warmed hearts at the CBC," referring to the CBC's championing of this move as a great day for transgender human rights. "It only continued from there. Trans-identifying bank robber Sam Steven Mellenbacher was kept in a female prison and, according to another inmate, caused 3 women to require the morning after pill. Mellenbacher went on to receive a sexual assault charge, but it was eventually dismissed. Most vile is perhaps the incarceration of baby rapist Tara D'Souza, Adam Lebuchan, I've written about before, and serial pedophile Madeleine Harks, or Matthew Harks, in a female facility. In 2021, a woman's advocate reported to the House of Commons that both individuals have been antagonizing a fellow inmate and her child in that facility's mother-child program." Now, you'll notice that the National Post very cleverly avoided using pronouns for any of these prisoners, therefore dodging the whole debate about whether or not Madeleine, Matthew, and Tara Adam are in fact males. They don't want to get into a debate about whether transgender women actually are women, and so what they do is they just quote the reality of what these prisoners are doing inside female prisons without getting into the argument that's really at the root of the entire policy and at the root of all the changes we've seen happen on the transgender agenda during the Trudeau tenure, which is, are transgender women women or not? And of course, the answer is they are not. They are males. Sex is a binary, and gender identity isn't relevant to your sex, full stop, whether it's relevant at all. And so before 2017, all pre-op trans prisoners being, again, the Post's way of wording this, I prefer the phrase trans-identifying prisoners, they were kept in a prison dedicated to their sex, and only post-op males, that is, males who had a sex change and were castrated, were allowed into female prisons. And a key factor limiting transfers was the fact that pre-op transgender identifying males weren't eligible for surgery unless they'd lived as a woman for several years. But in 2016, as a result of Netflix's trans plotline featuring Orange is the New Black, then Liberal Minister Ralph Goodale signed a more accommodating prison policy. And in January 2017, he unveiled the change. Prisoners would be eligible for cross-sex surgery if they lived as the opposite sex for 1 year in prison or out of prison. And get this, just a couple of days after this policy was announced, Justin Trudeau was confronted at a town hall by a transgender activist. And this activist accused the federal prison system of committing torture and decried the fact that Trudeau had promised to look into the matter and then uttered the magic words, trans rights or human rights.
I'm also a transgender advocate, and I am extremely happy that C-16 looks like it's going to pass and through the Senate very shortly. But what I want to talk about is one of the after effects of C-16, and that is with Corrections Canada. Corrections Canada has, in the past, been doing what I consider torture of transgender inmates by placing, like especially trans women, in a prison for men. Now, you would not, of course, consider the fact that a woman of any other type would be put in a men's prison, but trans women have been. This is especially of a concern when you read that one article out of Australia where a trans woman claims she had been raped over 2,000 times. Now, I'm not saying that happens in Canada. I strongly suspect a lot of trans women are put into segregation, which is not much better than solitary confinement. So my question to you is, will you do your best to ensure that trans women are put in prison, or prison more appropriate to their gender identity?
The answer is yes. I will ensure that. I mean, this is a great example of the value of having these community meetings like this in these town halls, because I'll admit I consider myself to be a fairly strong advocate for LGBTQ2 issues and fairly aware of all the different pressures, and this wasn't one that I had ever thought of. So thank you for bringing it forward, and I will make sure that we look at it and we address it, and we do right in recognizing that trans rights are human rights, that we need to make sure that we are defending everyone's dignity and rights in every way we can, and this is something that if we're not already addressing it, and I hope we're starting to address it even without my leaning in on it, now we will take a closer look at it. Thank you.
And a week later, 1 week after a trans activist confronted Justin Trudeau, federal prisons were ordered to evaluate transgender transfer requests on a case-by-case basis, eliminating this old standard entirely. And so Justin Trudeau personally accelerated exposing female prisoners to violent male offenders, all because of one trans activist at a town hall. That's how policy has been made in Canada now for years. And the Post goes on to point out that the majority of Canadians aren't on board with this. But again, the Post does ignore the real debate, which is when a male decides to identify as a woman, is he now a woman, yes or no? Is there some sort of weird process that goes on when he magically says, I am now a she, I am no longer Matthew, I am Madeline, I am no longer Adam, I am Tara? Does that mean that suddenly they are the thing that they claim to be, yes or no? And the mainstream media, again, some of them are finally pointing out the insanity of these policies, but they're not actually attacking the fundamental worldview supposition at the heart of these strategies. Now that gets me to why I think Pierre Poilievre has been handling this one so well, because as you know, you'll notice in the 2 tweets that I read out, he's simply avoiding the argument altogether, but he's avoiding the argument not by dodging it the way the National Post is doing here, by avoiding the use of certain pronouns, by avoiding the fundamental question. He's avoiding the debate by taking the side of sanity. And what I mean by that is he is not referring to these prisoners as trans-identifying prisoners. He's not referring to them as pre-op transgender women. He's simply saying they are males. Males should not be in women's prisons, full stop. The insanity is not that transgender prisoners are allowed inside prisons when they have not gone through a sex change. The insanity is that men are being put in women's prisons. And this is a carte blanche, complete rejection of the worldview, the ideology that has essentially dominated Canada's government for the last 9 years. Poilievre is ignoring the fundamental premise of both the Trudeau government's policy and of the transgender movement, that these violent male prisoners are women because they claim to be women. And what's clever here too is Poilievre is assuming correctly that the vast majority of Canadians do not actually believe this, and that as such, he can merely assert the facts of the matter and sidestep the transgender tar baby entirely. Trudeau believes that these violent criminals are women. Trans activists do as well. Poilievre clearly does not, and he is clearly asserting this fact, and because he won't play their game by their rules, he can't lose at their game. This strategy isn't immediately obvious because it isn't flashy. It's really common sense, and dare I say, it's very normal. Conservative influencer Benny Johnson recently decided to platform pimp pornographer and alleged rapist Andrew Tate on his show. Now, I want to explain for a minute why this is actually a big deal. There's a lot of debate on the internet about who Andrew Tate actually is. He has been charged with trafficking of a minor, he's been charged with rape, and despite his claims to the contrary, those charges have not actually been dismissed. He has charges pending in 2 countries, both Romania and the United Kingdom. But let's set all that aside for a moment. Let's assume he is not criminally guilty of any of the things he is accused of. Andrew Tate made his millions on trafficking and grooming young women in order to use their bodies to make him a fortune in pornography. This is something he has been bragging about for years. We're going to do a much longer episode later on this year, looking at Andrew Tate, looking at his grooming tactics, and looking at how he built his porn business and how he grifted a lot of conservatives into agreeing with him. But I want to note why it's so essential that we reject Andrew Tate as influencers who claim to be Christian or conservative. It's because Andrew Tate is guilty of sexual violence regardless of whether he is criminally liable for any of the things that he is accused of. He has bragged over and over and over again about perpetrating violence against women. I can't actually show you some of the video evidence for this, but other influencers like Andrew Clavin have actually aired video footage of him beating women on his podcast. Whether or not this is criminal sexual violence, it is sexual violence, and it's something that he champions. Now, Benny Johnson decided to have Andrew Tate on not for an interrogative interview, not for a hostile exchange about very different worldviews about what masculinity looks like, what femininity looks like, even what the problem with Western civilization is. Benny Johnson's Twitter bio says, "Let's save Western civilization together." And then he has Andrew Tate on in service of that goal, when I happen to think that people like Andrew Tate are one of the people that we're saving Western civilization from. And yet Benny Johnson, a man who claims to be Christian, as a father of young girls, is platforming Andrew Tate as a co-belligerent, as an ideological fellow traveler. Most recently because Andrew Tate, in response to the resurgence of the Rotherham rape gang scandal, says he wants to run for Prime Minister of the UK, which, considering he has a lot of experience in running grooming gangs, makes a lot of sense. Now, I want to emphasize here that Andrew Tate is not being accused by people like myself of things that we've read in court documents that are in dispute. I am noting what his public track record has actually said. Now, Johnson said, if you're upset that people you disagree with have conversations, you need to find another year to live in. It's 2025. Censorship and deplatforming is dead. People can think for themselves. We are free. Well, that's all true and also totally irrelevant, and Benny Johnson is deliberately missing the point to defend the indefensible, which is having somebody on who, his advice to young men was to choke a bitch until she can't breathe and she'll be yours forever. Those are his exact words. Most of the things Andrew Tate says cannot be actually stated on this podcast without extensive bleeping, but I'm going to show you two examples of Andrew Tate's public rhetoric. This isn't stuff that I've gotten from his files, his leaked files, which I've gone through. This is stuff that he has said publicly. Here's clip one.
So I'm on Twitter at the moment at @ofwudan, OFWUDAN. Try and follow me on Twitter if you can, because it's where I'm most active, but my Twitter accounts don't last that long, so who knows how long I'll be there for. So I'm on Twitter at the moment at @ofwudan, OFWUDAN. Try and follow me on Twitter if you can, because it's where I'm most active, but my Twitter accounts don't last that long, so who knows how long I'll be there for.
So in that video, what you saw is just a couple of examples of Andrew Tate's most vile tweets from one of the many Twitter accounts he was running, and that one got taken down. He's now back on X as Cobra Tate, but previously he tweeted under that name, as he said. Those are just a couple of comments, and I apologize in advance for the fact that they're quite vile, but not as vile as some of the things I'm going to show you in the next video. The only reason I'm going to show you any of the stuff that I'm about to show you, and I assure you that what we're about to show you is some of the least explicit and least graphic things that we could use to provide evidence for Andrew Tate's character and for the kinds of things he's been advocating for on his platform. But it's really important because absent this evidence, people can make the claim that Andrew Tate is just some sort of edgy influencer who likes to troll people by making crude comments about women that he doesn't actually mean. And he's done a very, very good job of saying one thing and then claiming that he wasn't serious, of degrading women but then claiming, oh, he's just making a joke and all the snowflakes are getting upset, of talking about beating women, treating them violently, engaging in sexual violence, and then later insisting he never said that to begin with. Because ever since their court case commenced in Romania, the Tate brothers have worked very hard to remove much of their content from the internet sphere so that people can't view video footage of them admitting to doing many of the things that they are accused of doing. One of the reasons they got famous to begin begin with is that Andrew Tate actually paid online influencers to torque his content across places like TikTok, where he had at one point 11 billion accumulated views on his video clips. And so let's take a look at this roundup of videos for just, again, another sense of the kind of person that was platformed by Benny Johnson, by Candace Owens, by Tucker Carlson, and somebody, unfortunately, who has several times been boosted by Elon Musk, who is clearly not aware of the kinds of things that you're about to see.
I do not hate women in any regard. I have no negative relationship with women.
I will state right now that I am absolutely sexist and I'm absolutely a misogynist.
She was a f***ing hoe, and I spotted it instantly because she didn't humble herself when she was supposed to. And I'm glad I didn't waste any more time on her, because she's never going to be doing like my other girls do, living in my house, letting me f*** other women, remaining loyal, and bringing me coffees and doing as I say. That's what you're looking for, gentlemen.
Well, you'll have one that you super care about. You'll have one which is the queen. You'll have one which has your family. You'll have one which is going to be above all others. You'll have one that you adore.
Yeah.
But it could be the same with cars. I could have one I truly love, and I could just pick up another one for a spin.
Take over everything. No one's driving my cars but me. It's like my women. Put my name on them. For life. Boom. Done. Even if I don't want them anymore, they can just sit at home while I play with the younger ones.
You're honest with women, you get just headache on both sides. They don't want honesty. When you come to a woman with honesty, it's just they're not ready to handle it. They are not prepared for it, and it also lowers your status as a man.
Imagine a Muslim wife sitting there in her burqa trying to say this crap.
But the way I was feeling different inside, and I had to psychological dirty me do.
You get stoned. You're about to feel something, a rock in your face. Can I say this on YouTube? Yeah, I can say this on YouTube. I've legitimately done that. Girls running their mouth. I just start beating the out of them. I'm not even having sex. They love it more than ever. They like it more. The less sex you have with them, the better. So I don't know why you're trying to give me your opinion, because I don't put any responsibility on you to perform in basically any way outside of the bedroom. So just shush.
Women are only loyal to one thing, and that's the dick they're sucking.
I don't even really want to f the girl. I want to know, like, she better love me afterwards. I need to get paid. I got rent. Like,
how do I use these women to make money?
I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with women doing OnlyFans, as long as I had influence and control over it.
First things first, the reason women need a man to do OnlyFans is the same reason a woman need a man to do anything, because they're incompetent and they're very, very lazy.
Doing a video photographer to get the angles, yeah?
No. I'm not doing any real work, but just like taking all the money.
And they're stupid.
If my chick said, I want to do OnlyFans, I'm like, all right, then cool, go do it. How much you made? 10 grand, all right, give me 8. All right, cool. All right.
What woman is going to give you 8 grand?
Because you're my woman, you're doing OnlyFans, you're selling my product.
It's about the fact that she belongs to him and the intimate parts of her body belong to him because they're in a relationship. And if she wants to sell those, he has a stake in those intimate parts of her body.
So it's reverse. Male porn star owes the woman.
I don't know, because I think the women belong to the man. I think the woman's given over
that's inherently where you get called sexist.
There are hours and hours and hours of this content that you can see on X, that you can see on YouTube, that you can see on other social media platforms. And the reason I emphasize that is because somebody like Benny Johnson has absolutely no excuse for platforming Andrew Tate as a co-belligerent, as an ideological fellow traveler, as somebody who's going to help save Western civilization. Someone like Tucker Carlson has absolutely no excuse for deciding to consider Andrew Tate somebody who was on their side. Somebody like Candace Owens has absolutely no excuse for thinking that Andrew Tate is fundamentally a good guy and for constantly associating with him positively and constantly referring to him in a positive way, as she has done. Let's say, for the sake of argument, and I do not for a second believe this, that Andrew Tate and Tristan Tate are exonerated of every single thing that they are currently charged with. And the reason I do not believe this is because I have been through the private files that were leaked from their war room and many, many other documents. I wrote a long investigative report with a private investigator for the European Conservative detailing what those files said. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that they are in fact exonerated or that the charges against them collapse. Even if that's the case, their own public record explains what they think of women, boasts about using pornography, proves that the things that Andrew Tate said to people like Candace Owens about only having done pornography for a brief time and now having moved on are lies. Many of the clips I just showed you are very recent clips. Proves that sexual violence is something they are enthusiastic about and have practiced very, very often. And that just violence against women, as Andrew Tate said, can I say this on YouTube? I'm going to, and explained how he treats women. All of that indicates that we are dealing with somebody, again, a pimp, a pornographer, an enthusiastic participant in sexual violence. This is the kind of person we need to be saving Western civilization from, not participating in saving Western civilization for. Now, if Andrew Tate is the answer, what is the question? And the reality is that a lot of guys like Benny Johnson, the reason they're having Andrew Tate on is for cheap clicks. They are essentially sacrificing character and integrity in order to get at the big audience that they know that Andrew Tate always brings. This is garbage. Anybody who has daughters, anybody who cares about Western values, associating with Andrew Tate is evidence that you have no discernment whatsoever. I propose a litmus test for conservative influencers. If they think Andrew Tate is on their side, they have no credibility and we should not listen to them whatsoever. Because if you manage to miss all of these video clips, there are dozens and dozens of hours, many of which I've unfortunately watched, right across these platforms that say things just like this, in many cases worse, in many cases cruder. And so if you think Andrew Tate's a good guy, I think you're an idiot, and I don't think that we should be listening to you about any issue of any seriousness. Thanks everyone for listening to this episode of The Briefing. If you'd like to check out our other content, you can check out any of the major podcast platforms. If you thought this video was helpful, please do share it around. Like the video, comment on it. Feel free to get into an argument in the comments or drop a link to a story that you think that we should cover. Thanks so much for taking the time. We appreciate it.